privacy doesn't have to be all or nothing. The inability to attain extreme levels of privacy shouldn't deter one from taking any protective measures at all. There exists a concept of just enough. We have to take a balanced approach to mitigating risk. And here's your host, Ray Heffer, a cybersecurity expert bringing you practical advice on securing your digital life.
This is episode 11 of The Lockdown, and I'm back after spending some well-deserved time like a recluse, living in the mountains, enjoying the quiet and contemplation. I've often dreamt about living off-grid, away from the busyness of day-to-day life. But for many of us, myself included, well, we have responsibilities. I can't just pack my bags and disappear like a forest dweller, which, by the way, is one of the 4 stages of life in Hindu and Buddhist practices for the seeker of enlightenment. Now, something that we often neglect is the state of our mental health, especially in cybersecurity. It's already a tough industry to work in, but it's something that can take its toll. And to be honest, we all need some time away just to reflect, contemplate and consider our true priorities in life. So taking this break has allowed me to recharge, but I've still been very busy behind the scenes. But I did manage to spend some time in the mountains after purchasing a house, which is pretty much off-grid. Now, I want to share the anonymous purchase techniques, the pitfalls and some of the hurdles I encountered during the purchase of the house. Now, as you can appreciate, purchasing a new home is not easy, especially when you're trying to keep privacy in mind. So that's what's kept me busy for the last few months, as well as some other projects. One of the directions I would like to take this show is to balance privacy and security more. I think this show, as well as many others, are so heavily focused on privacy that we often forget and neglect the reasons we do this. And this is why I came up with this all or nothing philosophy, if you want to call it that, which is the all or nothing argument. And I hear this all the time. People think, I can't attain extreme levels of privacy, so I might as well just give up. In fact, I overheard a conversation the other day where someone said, everyone's got my data anyway. It's all out there. So what's the point? Well, let's not forget the security aspect of this. There are some out there that happen to like the services Apple or Google have to offer. Their security is actually pretty damn good. Look at Apple, for example. If you lose an Apple device, you can mark it as lost. You can remotely wipe the device. And their iCloud account security is much better than it was, with 2-factor authentication being sent to existing devices you own. And as much as I love GrapheneOS, and that's what I use every single day, it's my daily driver, I'm not going to suggest a Pixel 8 Pro with GrapheneOS to my grandmother. It's just not going to be practical at all. What's more important to her is security. And this is where understanding your threat comes in, or I would call it threat modeling. Now, typically, day to day, when I talk about threat modeling, I'm talking about security architects, security engineers, security analysts as part of a security team in an organization, trying to understand the threats and ways to mitigate those threats. In fact, there's a website, owasp.org, and I love their definition the best, which basically says threat modeling is a family of activities for improving security by identifying threats and then defining countermeasures to prevent or mitigate the effects of threats to the system. Now, in our case, the system is us, it's you and me. And the threat we are trying to mitigate against is the exposure of our private information. We want to keep it confidential. Again, I have probably mentioned this before, but as a Chief Information Security Officer, you operate according to the CIA triad. That's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And I would apply the same approach to us as individuals. We want to keep our data confidential. We want to make sure it's not tampered with. It needs to have integrity. And it also needs to be available. And this last piece is often overlooked. So let's go back to the example of my grandmother. Let's just say I gave her a GrapheneOS device, very secure, everything's locked down, but then suddenly there is a problem. She installs an app or perhaps can't log in to her online banking app because of incompatibilities with the lack of Google Play services, whatever the reason. But now she's lost availability to do what she needs to do to run her business, in this case, her day-to-day life. And in fact, I've had this before. I was at an airport and the American Airlines app would not allow me to log in. I had to get a paper ticket, which I was actually fine with. But for others, that may be a problem. They want to track their flight. They want to have access to the application. But the point I'm making here is we have to balance both privacy and security together. And this is an ongoing battle. Our governments want transparency. Now, especially in the US, many states allow you to download the voter records. And one particular state I was looking at provides this as an Excel spreadsheet, which I find absolutely shocking because it's not just voter records, and it's anonymized. No, it has first name, last name, address, date of birth. These are all the things needed for someone to carry out a SIM swap attack and do social engineering on the cell phone provider or other nefarious practices. We have to have an element of privacy in order to stay secure. Unfortunately, trust is not something that's a given. But this whimsical attitude, unfortunately, has been reflected in the policies and processes of organisations, where they say they take security and privacy seriously, but I'm questioning whether they really understand what that means. Okay, I've been rambling for far too long, so let's focus on the house purchase, the hurdles and the successes as well that I encountered in purchasing the house and titling it anonymously. I created my revocable living trust several years ago now, and originally the house I was in was titled in my real name, so changing it to a trust had some benefits for privacy, but much of the damage had already been done. Now, if you own a house today, you will have the title of that property registered with your home county. This is just one of the sources that data brokers use, which I spoke about, by the way, in episode 9. And they harvest your data to enrich their people search sites and algorithms. And this is why it's so easy, at least in the US, just to Google someone's name and find out where they live. Now, if you were like me several years ago that didn't initially put their house title in a living trust and you changed it after the fact, all is not lost. I think first off, a lot of data brokers are looking at the current records and they probably check every 6 to 12 months or so. So it's going to take some time. But if you use data removal services such as Optory, who I spoke to in episode 9, you can remove a lot of your data and make some headway. It's not going to be perfect, but you're going to remove the bulk of it. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is you can create your revocable living trust yourself. I've actually got a book here by Nolo, Nolo, and it's called Make Your Own Living Trust, 16th edition. It's a great book, but if you can afford it, I strongly recommend getting an estate planning attorney, at least here in the United States, to do this for you. And also, much of the information I have found online neglects to clarify a few things. First of all, if you own your house, you paid for it in cash, you have no mortgage or loan on it, well then you're in a much better position because you can just change the title deeds with your county after creating your revocable living trust and you're done. You probably have to inform your home insurance, but other than that, there's no one else involved. Now, if, like me, you have not won the lottery and you have a mortgage on your home, you must get permission from the mortgage lender. You're going to have all sorts of problems if you try and do this without informing them. Several years ago, I remember speaking to my mortgage lender and saying, okay, I want to put my home in a revocable living trust. Now, you can create the trust. There's nothing stopping you doing that. But to move the home, they had several requirements. One of them was to have a bank account for the trust. So I actually had to have a membership savings account in the name of the revocable living trust. They then get their legal team to review the trust document and the name that's going to appear on the title deed. This is very important. You don't technically own the house. The mortgage provider does. If you stop paying your mortgage payments, guess what? They're going to repossess your home to pay off the balance of the mortgage. So this is why you must involve your mortgage lender. Now, several years ago, I did this. I had a very helpful person on the other end speak with the legal team, and everything was put in play. Now, many estate planning attorneys and mortgage lenders and even the county records are going to expect you to put your full name as part of the title deed. So, for example, if your name is John Smith, they'd like it to be titled as John Smith of the blah, 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 Revocable Living Trust, or John Smith and Mary Smith of the something living trust. So they want your first name, last name, and the name of the trust. Well, that defeats the object when it comes to privacy. Sure, we're going to have benefits of the trust, such as your assets not going into probate should something happen to you, but the privacy side is completely pointless at that stage because the county records, the title deeds, are going to have your name. Now, the first estate planning attorney I used suggested that we put the title in his name. So it would be John Smith of the Lockdown Security Trust. He will put the title in that name and then he will immediately resign as a trustee because there's no requirement to update the county records when trustees join or resign from the trust. I really didn't like it, but that was the only thing he was willing to do. Now, I've stopped using this particular estate planning attorney just because of other issues, but technically you can do that. I really do not recommend it, having done it. It was actually interesting getting a whole heap of junk mail in his name to my house. But I think the biggest concern I had is his name is on the title deed. If he wanted to do something bad, it might not be too much of a stretch for him to prove he owns the house, which obviously he did not. This is actually the benefit of having a mortgage on the property because the mortgage company knows who you are. And this is why they want the trust and the title deed to satisfy their legal requirements. So a year later, I found a different estate planning attorney to do some updates. Now, he was someone that had worked with an FBI agent that wanted to do exactly what I wanted to achieve and have trustee of Lockdown Security Trust. And by the way, that's not the name of my trust, but we'll use that from now on just to keep things simple. So he said, before you can use trustee of Lockdown Security Trust, you have to get permission from your mortgage lender. So I spoke to the mortgage lender and they said the actual trust document still needs to have our name. The certificate of trust, which is a document they provided and had to be notarized, also had to have my real name. But as far as the name on the title deed registration of the county, they don't care. Trustee of works fine. And I had the legal approval. Great news. Okay, so let's skip forward to the present day. I was in the mountains and was buying a semi-off-grid property. It has a well. I still had to get electric utility, so it's not completely off-grid, but hey, it has the potential for that. I wanted to do things right from the start. So, as part of the purchase, I informed the mortgage lender that I was going to do the same. I wanted to have trustee of the Lockdown Security Trust, and I also advised the attorney dealing with the sale. They said as long as the mortgage company approves it, they're good with it. Again, I had to have a similar conversation with them, not saying that I was an FBI agent, but sometimes just using the excuse that I'm in the cybersecurity field, working with data breaches every day. I don't want to be part of that because of reputational damage. That put them at ease a bit, and they understood why I wanted to do this. Well, here was the first problem. It was the day of the signing to close the contract, and my mortgage lender said, we've got to have your real name in it. We can't do this. Your trust document, which, by the way, I just gave them a copy of, on the first page says the following. Our trust is called the Lockdown Security Trust. However, the following format should be used for taking title to assets. Ray Heffer, trustee of the Lockdown Security Trust. Basically, my trust document was shooting me in the foot. It was stating that I had to have my first and last name and the trust name for any assets taking title. So because of that, the mortgage company had to go back to their legal department. I was willing to get the trust document changed. Again, this is the benefit of a revocable living trust. You can make changes to it. You can add trustees, you can remove trustees. Now, After just a few hours, I was very lucky that I got a phone call and they said, we managed to find the original legal approval in the archives and we could use that, and the sale went ahead. But these are things that often you don't hear about. The next challenge was utilities. Being in the middle of nowhere, water was supplied by a well. There was no gas line to the property. Internet I'll talk about later. So electricity was the main utility that I needed to transfer to my name. Now, we are dealing with a mountainous region, very rural, in the middle of nowhere. So the local mountain company is probably not the most sophisticated in terms of technology, and certainly not for security and privacy. I phoned them. I said, "Hi, I've just purchased a property and I need to switch the account into my name." "No problem." They said, "You need to go to this URL and there'll be a form. Please fill the form in." So I said, "Great, I'll do that." So I go to this form, which was on their website, and their website was running on a web server which was severely out of date and had dozens of vulnerabilities. I am talking dozens. What was more concerning was the data they're collecting. They wanted my social security number, driving license number. They wanted me to upload a copy of my driving license or passport, any government-issued ID, with a whole bunch of other information, phone number, email, all the other stuff. Now, the file upload, I did a test. I just created a text file, renamed it to .php, and then I uploaded it, and it uploaded fine. Now, the reason that's a concern, and I'm crossing into a grey area here of ethical hacking. This was an empty file. There was nothing in there. But should that be, say, a file upload utility that I'd written in PHP, and I can then access that, well, now I can compromise the server, and all these forms that have been saved to the server, I can download. Obviously, you can understand this is a data breach waiting to happen. So I called them back. Now, the person on the phone was one of 6 people that work in this office in the mountains. And when I explained the situation, they said, "I'll pass that on to our IT lady." I said, "Do you have anyone that's responsible for security?" She said, "Yes, that's the IT lady." I said, "Okay." I said, "Is there any way around this? I don't want to provide all this." And again, I used the same story that, "Hey, I work in cybersecurity. I'm not allowed to do this." Also, being a British citizen, I use that excuse as well, saying I'm not allowed to give you any ID. It's in breach of GDPR. But again, a lot of that is nonsense. I just wanted her to give me an alternative. So she said, if I visit the office, I can just show her the ID to prove it's me. They don't need to take a copy of it. And as for the social security number, if I give them a security deposit, that will waive the requirement to do that. Basically, it covers them. I've given them a deposit. So should I refuse to pay, they've got the money that they can keep and hold back. So I did that. I turned up at their office and showed them the ID. And it was quite funny. It was, if you've watched Stranger Things, Sheriff Hopper's office, the actual sheriff's office from the 80s, this place looked exactly the same. I am not joking. Wood paneling, telephones everywhere. It was like stepping back in time to the 80s, which isn't really too surprising. This is in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. Now, the name of the trust I have could pass for someone's last name. So I used that as the name. They saw my ID, but they let me use that other name, which was great. I'm not sure if they should have done, but maybe that was an oversight on their part. But the fact I paid them a security deposit for the account was enough to satisfy their requirements. They didn't take any copies of my ID, and my mind is put at rest. Now, obviously, the only other information they have of mine is a pseudo phone number and an alias email address, which is specific to them. So I'm pretty well covered. However, something else happened, which was more concerning. A few days later, I noticed I had 2 accounts. There was the electricity supply to the house, but also a separate account to the well pump. Now, the well pump is actually maintained by someone else. While it resides on my property, I'm not responsible for the payment. It's imagine a small community and they all pay the treasurer towards the water. Without any verification, they took the account out of someone else's name and put it in my name. And it just goes to show how their lack of process and lack of maturity when it comes to security and privacy could cause significant issues. If I wanted to cut someone's electricity supply off, I could go in there and say I've just purchased the house and get it taken out of their name. We managed to get that mess cleared up. I spoke to the actual owner for the well pump, and he managed to get it put back with my approval. Now, internet, you'd think in the middle of nowhere in the mountains would be pretty abysmal, but I was very lucky. There was a local provider that was offering fibre. So it's very fast, actually the fastest I've ever had, because I've got a gigabit up and a gigabit down for my download speeds. And again with them, I didn't have to use my real name. They didn't want a social security number. They just wanted a security deposit to do that. So that was a win-win. Now that's going to very much depend on who your internet provider is. But I just wanted to share this experience because it's not always as straightforward as you read. This book I've got is great, but it does get more complicated, especially if you have kids, you have successor trustees, and you have nuances to the trust in terms of what happens should you die, who has responsibility for the trust until your kids reach a certain age, and so on. So I strongly recommend an estate planning attorney to do that. And stand your ground. Don't allow them to use your first and last name as part of the title deed. You don't have to do that. You might have to fight, but say you really need trustee of and then the trust name. Okay, let's move on, and I want to give you another update on GrapheneOS. Now I've been using it for, I'd say, well over a year, probably coming up 2 years. I've lost track of time. But I really wanted to get out of the Apple ecosystem. I think I've said this before. Most of my family have iPhones, iPads, and that's fine. At least I know they can back up to iCloud. As I said before, I think it's very secure. I just don't think it's the best for privacy enthusiasts. Also, I'm just not a fan of Apple products. They seem to break or slow down after a year or two and then need expensive replacements or Apple Care. The great thing with something like GrapheneOS, I've got a Pixel 7 phone here, I've got a Pixel 8 Pro, I can switch between them. And while there's no easy backup and restore option yet, I believe that something better is coming. Honestly, I don't have to restore anything anyway. I can just install my apps, set it up from scratch, and I'm back up and running. Now, I do have some problems with GrapheneOS, I think I mentioned before, and some minor inconveniences. One of the things I don't like, and I don't know if it's related to the Pixel 8 Pro, or it happens on Pixel 7 as well, or this is a GrapheneOS problem, but the adaptive brightness always goes too low and I can't see. I like to have a bright display, but it always seems to default to the minimum. It thinks obviously the environment is dark enough that I can see it, but I can't. And I wish I could have like a minimum brightness level of 50%. But as I say, that's a minor inconvenience. And then the more major problem I've had was the fact I was using Nextcloud to back up my photos and videos. There's an auto-upload feature in Nextcloud. You point it to your camera folder, and any pictures and videos that appear should then be uploaded to Nextcloud. Now, in my case, as you probably remember, my Nextcloud is local only. There's no internet access to it. So it worked well. It always used to back up over Wi-Fi when I got home, and all was good. But for whatever reason, over the past, say, 6 to 8 months, I'm not sure what changed, it stopped backing up videos. It's done this on my Pixel 7 and also my Pixel 8 Pro. So there's something going on. I've obviously reinstalled everything, haven't been able to get video uploads working. But I also noticed today there was a couple of missing photos. So I thought, okay, I'm going to blame this on the Nextcloud implementation. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to look for alternatives. So I started using Proton Drive. Now, obviously, we're all a fan of Proton Mail, I think it's safe to say. Proton Drive is very good. I'd say it's fairly limited in functionality if you compare it to Dropbox, for example, but that's for good reason. It's very secure. What I do like is I can share photos, I can create a link, but the main thing is the auto-upload works. It backs up all my photos and videos, and I don't have to be on my local network to do so. But I still use Nextcloud because it works really well with KeePass DX, which is my password manager. That can point at Nextcloud and it always grabs the most up-to-date copy of the password database. And as I talked about in a previous episode, I started moving away from Authy by Twilio. I still think Authy is a great product. I know they abandoned the desktop app or stopped support for it at least. And that wasn't the main reason for me. I just wanted something more controlled by myself, self-hosted, and something local. And what I use is Nextcloud and KeePass DX for that. And I have a separate KeePass database for my two-factor authentication codes. It's got a separate password, and it works really well. And most of the arguments you hear against something like that is the all your eggs in one basket argument. But because they are two separate database files, I don't really subscribe to that. If my password database is compromised, well, the two-factor codes aren't in there. The backup codes for the two-factor authentication are not in there either. And that's important. I've mentioned this before. There's no point having separate two-factor authentication, perhaps a YubiKey, if your recovery codes are in your password database. Then what's the point? Obviously, it does serve some purpose, but you get where I'm coming from. So I prefer to have a separate KeePass database just for my two-factor authentication codes, and that works really well. But overall, I'm really happy with GrapheneOS. And the other day, I was helping a family member with their iPhone, and I must admit, I didn't like it. I much prefer the interface of GrapheneOS, the ability to block certain applications from accessing the internet, which also, when you install an app, it will prompt you, would you like to allow network access? And if you don't need network access, you can do no, which I think is really nice. And then one last thing I'd like to mention is the use of fingerprints or biometric ID to access the device. This is a difficult one. I've mentioned this before, and I have been criticized for this. You will hear from privacy and security enthusiasts that the best option is a very long PIN code. And I agree. I really do. I think that is the best option. However, if you frequently travel like I do, and you're having to unlock your phone in public spaces, that can become problematic because cameras these days are at least 4K and they can easily see what you're typing. But also, if you're flying on a plane, for example, and you want to unlock your phone while sitting in the seat, it's very easy for someone sitting behind you or even next to you to see what PIN code you're typing in. Now, the argument against using fingerprints is that some governments are allowed to force you to give the fingerprint, but they can't force you to enter a password or PIN code. What I would love to see on GrapheneOS is a combination of using your fingerprint and then a shorter PIN code as a secondary method of authentication. So perhaps I can put my fingerprint in there and then 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't use that, but you see what I'm getting at. Rather than having just one long, more complex PIN. But again, it comes back down to your threat model. If you don't travel and you don't have an issue typing the PIN in without someone overlooking and seeing what you're doing, then that's actually where I would recommend you go, is stick with PIN numbers. I've seen some Android phones use those patterns. People swipe a pattern across the screen. They're terrible. Straight away, you can look at the pattern, and then if you were to steal their phone, you can grab it. Now, I mentioned travel because there are certain places in the world where pickpocketing, theft of your phone is absolutely rife. Barcelona is one such place. I used to go to Mobile World Congress each year, which is in the GrapheneOS Center in Barcelona. And that place was a nightmare. Everyone I know used to have their bag stolen or their phone stolen. Luckily, I was never targeted. Now, the security aspect of this, it's worth mentioning that security doesn't just have to be cyber or technical. I believe the reason I never had my phone stolen or any pickpockets or my bag stolen was a number of factors. First of all, I would never walk around outside holding my phone or anything obvious. My bag, I would actually change my bag for something that looks like quite a scruffy backpack, not a laptop bag or an over-the-shoulder bag, which many times as a business traveller you would travel with. If you're wearing a suit and an over-the-shoulder bag, there's obviously going to be a MacBook or something of value in there. So I would avoid that. But also I would walk very quickly with a sense of purpose. Look like you know where you're going. You're not lost. You're not strolling around looking at the sights. When you need to go from point A to point B, walk with purpose. If you look like a difficult target that's moving fast, the bag doesn't look like it's got anything of value in there, then you're not as attractive. And I believe that's why after several years of going to Barcelona every year, I think from about 2012 2011 was the first time I went there. But anyway, never got pickpocketed. But there are other places in the world. I'm not just picking on Barcelona. There's other places as well. And one of the things they would do is they will have someone look at the code that you type, a PIN code or the pattern, and then steal your phone. Then they can unlock it, they can reset it, and then sell it. Now, with a fingerprint, if there was the ability to have that secondary code, even better, because even if someone forced me to place my finger on the device, I would still need a PIN code as well. And if that is available and I'm missing something really obvious here, please let me know. I might be missing the point, but I've looked for that feature and I couldn't find it. So perhaps if the developers of GrapheneOS are listening, that's something you could add to your very long list, I'm sure, of features. But the other protection I have put in place is after a certain number of hours, the phone will reboot. Now, when the phone reboots, you cannot use your fingerprint. You must type the PIN code. While I'm asleep at night, after a few hours, the phone reboots and no one can just grab that phone and unlock it with my fingerprint while I'm sleeping, because that's obviously restarted. You can also reboot it yourself manually, but quite honestly, I would forget, and I'm sure many other people would as well. Now, while I'm on the subject of phones, I mentioned last time that I switched to Tello. So I had an email from a listener. First of all, it was back in March, so apologies for the delay. Hopefully you're listening to this and you can get the answer. But I'll read some of the email out. You said, after researching Tello, I found they do not have the option for TOTP for account access. So in other words, there's no PIN or two-factor authentication to access the account. They go on to say it seems there is a PIN which is required for port in and port out, but that's separate from the account password. This does not protect against access to the account itself. And Mint Mobile does have TOTPs, that's time-based one-time password, which I found effective when I tried to obtain a port out, blah, blah, blah. So what they're saying is, they can't protect the account with a secondary PIN. And this is the main reason for this is to protect against SIM swap attacks. The reason I still use Tello, despite that lack of account security, is the account is not in my name. It's in a completely made up alias name. I pay with a privacy.com card. I don't use that phone number anywhere at all for any reason. If I need to use a real SIM card number, you can get some really cheap Tello SIMs. I have another Tello SIM, which is my burner number, and I use that. Most of the time you'll find my pseudo numbers, these VoIP numbers, they're issued from Twilio and other providers. They're just not going to work. They're blocked. They're registered as VoIP numbers. So you could port in an actual burner SIM and use that real number. I think eventually it would get flagged as a VoIP number, but that would work initially. But honestly, I don't think there's a real need to do that. I prefer to have a couple of cheap burner SIMs. I think you can do it for as low as $5 a month. For some reason, I'm thinking it's $7 a month. I'm not sure why, but anyway, you can look at that on Tello. If you just need SMS messages, it's very cheap. But the main protection here is they can't do a SIM swap attack because they won't know the identity I've used for the account. They won't know the number. I don't use that number anywhere else. Now, finally, on the GrapheneOS device, how do I take notes? Someone actually asked me. I've actually had a few people ask me this. I think I may have mentioned before that on my PC and on my laptop, I use Obsidian. I'm a really big fan of the Obsidian Notes editor. I have it pointing to a folder in Nextcloud just called Notes, and it treats everything as folders and files. So whatever I see on disk is what I see in Obsidian, and that's really important to me. In the past, I'd used apps like Joplin, but I don't like this file structure, which means if I had lost access to the app for some reason, I can't just go into the text file. Now, I know a number of you use Standard Notes, and I am actually a big fan of Standard Notes, but I don't use it. I'd just like to tell you why. So the first issue, which I can do with Obsidian, is I have Nextcloud, as I mentioned, and a folder called Notes. That's all my personal notes. And then for work, I actually have a separate Nextcloud account, which is just for personal file sync. So if I need to download one of my payslips or something along those lines, any personal documents that I need on my business laptop, I use Nextcloud to sync that. But that also allows me to take my own personal notes as well. Now, if you work for an employer, they may dictate that you must use OneNote and OneDrive and all of these things, which, you have to abide by the IT policy. You sign the contract, that's what you have to do. And I'm not saying to circumvent that, but for your personal notes, perhaps you need to make some notes after a promotion, or you're trying to track your performance, things that are not related to your job function necessarily, but more personal notes related to your employer. Well, for that, I have Obsidian on my work laptop with a separate Nextcloud account just for my work. And the same thing, I have a notes folder in there. And the great thing with that is, with Obsidian on my desktop, I can open up what's called a separate vault. And I can open up my personal notes and also my work notes. It works really well. Now, one of the issues with standard notes is the inability to have a separate workspace or vault for home and work, which is really important. There was actually a GitHub issue that someone logged about this a couple of years ago, or maybe about a year ago now. And I believe the issue was closed. It didn't go anywhere. And I thought, well, if you pay for a premium account, it's linked to your email address, you'd have to pay for another premium account to do this. I just think that's a bit short-sighted. They should at least allow for separate vaults or workspaces. And then the other issue I had with standard notes is, remember, I have potentially thousands of text files. They're actually markdown format, so they're plain text, .md files. Now, you might think, okay, it's plain text, that's not encrypted, that's really bad. But bear with me here. Those files are stored at rest on my PC or my laptop, both of which have full disk encryption. Communication to the Nextcloud server is over HTTPS, so there's encryption in transit. So while the files themselves aren't encrypted, I don't store anything in there that's super secret anyway. They are just day-to-day notes and to-do lists and draft blog posts, but I do have thousands of them. Now, these are .md files. As I say, you can treat them like text files, and you can't bulk import markdown files into standard notes. I actually opened a support ticket. The reason you can't do it is it tries to convert it to their own proprietary format. So this proprietary format is called supernotes, and they're stored as JSON files. They're basically plain text backups. Now, considering I have many thousands of notes, let's say in the future that I don't have access to the standard notes app for whatever reason, or the professional subscription I had then expires. Well, then I'm left with a backup of JSON files that would make it extremely difficult for me to read. If I open that up in VS Code or Notepad, yes, they're plain text. I can read them, but it's a mess. Now, for me, it's really important that I have the ability to have a local copy of all my notes in plain text or markdown format. So no matter what happens, I have my notes in its original format. Also, the same folder structure would be helpful as well. And this is why I abandoned Joplin many years ago. So while I think standard notes is excellent, I'm not interested in a proprietary format. These supernotes can't be opened in anything else. Markdown is an industry standard. I've been using it for decades. I'm very much used to typing in that way. So, yes, I'm a fan of standard notes. I like the way it works from a security perspective. I think the interface is very easy to use. But honestly, for someone like me that has thousands of notes in markdown format, I'm not willing to import them all into standard notes, convert to this proprietary format, and then potentially lose access to notes in the future. Now, I think perhaps my use case may be fairly unique. And if that's not going to apply to you, then standard notes is a great option. So what I have to do on my GrapheneOS device is use Nextcloud Notes, which is terrible, but it does allow me to access all the notes in the notes folder. I rarely edit on the phone. This is more for reference. I would like a Obsidian app that works on GrapheneOS and can link to Nextcloud, but I can't do all those things. So Obsidian's for the desktop and Nextcloud Notes for the phone. Now, some final notes on GrapheneOS, and this is more around the Play Integrity API by Google. Application developers are using the Play Integrity API to basically check that the phone hasn't been jailbroken, it's running a valid operating system, it's an authentic device, and so on. And more application developers are using this. So I mentioned the American Airlines app. That's a great example. It uses the Play Integrity API to check that the device is valid and, in their mind, secure. But they haven't whitelisted GrapheneOS as a trusted device. Application developers really need to understand that blindly using this API out the box really isn't helping the situation. But the biggest issue I had with a number of apps is the Play Integrity API, which, by the way, is probably why you can't use ChatGPT on GrapheneOS. It needs the Play services running. It needs to have a Google account. It won't even direct you to log in. It will just redirect you to log into the Google Play Store. I did look at some other options, perhaps using LineageOS with Micro G or Calyx, both of which have a slightly different implementation to get this working. In the end, though, I came back to GrapheneOS. So with LineageOS with Micro G, that's basically running Google services or the Google Play services. I still think, though, you would have the problem with this Play Integrity API. It cannot find a valid operating system or whatever checks it's doing because they haven't whitelisted it. Again, this is why application developers need to whitelist GrapheneOS and LineageOS and Calyx, all of these things, as a valid operating system. The other solution I found out there, which I highly discourage against, is rooting the device and using something like Magisk. That's Magisk. If you root your device, you are opening yourself up for a potential security nightmare. You can allow applications to have full kernel access to the phone. Not a good idea. So despite some minor inconveniences, I still think GrapheneOS is the best phone out there for both privacy and security, and I'm not going to stop using it anytime soon. I think it's an excellent solution and it works very well for me. I have a question for you. Have you watched the TV show Baby Reindeer on Netflix? I feel so sorry for that guy because if he had just listened to this podcast and taken a few steps, such as using an alias name with a prepaid SIM, my sudo, and some alias emails, he probably could have stopped the majority of the hassle from the stalker he had. But this actually raises a real life threat. That TV show was based on a true story, I believe, and it was the writer of the show that had experienced this and decided to write a screenplay. So good on him for turning it into an advantage. And hopefully, I think he's made quite a lot of money from it. It's a great TV series. But it does go to show that overnight, that guy, he works in a bar, he's struggling as a comedian, he leads quite a boring life. Probably someone that would have said, hey, I've got nothing to hide. But suddenly his life is turned upside down, and it's in that moment he would have wished to have implemented all the techniques and strategies that we talk about on this show. So before we end the show, I'd like to answer a few more emails that I've been receiving over the past few weeks. I'm not going to mention names. Obviously, this is a privacy podcast, so if I did mention a name, I've just made it up. So this is from Beatrix Potter. And she says, I recently discovered your podcast and website and wanted to thank you for taking the time to create this. I've implemented a few of your tips, but ran into a couple of dead ends and wondered if there are solutions. Okay, first one. Privacy.com seems like a great idea, so I signed up, but then it asked for my birth date and social security number. I'm not really sure why this is required, so I just deleted the account. Okay, first let me address that one. First off, thank you for listening. I'm creating this show because I'm very passionate about the subject. I do also believe this is a community as well. So feel free to go to my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/thelockdown. You can join for free. And you don't have to pay to be a member. If you do want to pay, I have 3 tiers. Tinfoil Hat, which is $3 a month, Ghost at $5 a month, and Redacted for $15 a month. That basically covers the cost of running this podcast, the hosting, and will pay for my caffeine addiction. Anyway, there's no obligation to do that. I just wanted to throw that in there. So yeah, privacy.com, they are required. There are various regulations in place that will require them to collect that information. You are hiding your real details from the merchant, not from your bank or the government. So the reason they ask for your birth date and social security number is it's a requirement for any financial account. Now, Michael Bazell from Intel Techniques posted a blog a few days ago on a similar service called Cloaked, and he mentions they do exactly the same thing. I have no experience of Cloaked, so I'm not going to talk about that, but I do use privacy.com. Now, you've got to remember, you are hiding the details from the merchant. You have to assume that when you order some t-shirts or those coffee beans or whatever it is you're buying online, that merchant is going to suffer a data breach, perhaps at the hands of a ransomware attack, perhaps just through negligence. Unfortunately, in my day job, I see this happening every single day. But back to privacy.com, should you create the account? That's up to you. If you're opening a bank account, you still have to give them that information. You probably have to give them more than that information. They want to see your ID. And the way I think privacy.com works behind the scenes, and this is speculation, by the way, is over time, your trust profile builds up. They see you just making regular payments and not doing anything illegal. Obviously, it would be too easy for criminals to use privacy.com for fraud or other purposes. So they need to make sure they know who you are. But what it does give you is the ability to hide your information from the merchants you're paying with. Your bank statement will just show privacy.com. There's even some fun options to use Smiley's Corner Store or the NSA for some of the merchant names. But if the US government need to find out who made a purchase with a privacy.com card, they can go straight to privacy.com and issue a subpoena or a warrant and get that information. They still have to oblige by financial regulations. Okay, so your next one in emails, you say, I also tried my sudo, but it seems the only way to pay is to share payment information with Google Pay. I haven't got experience of that. I have briefly tried my sudo, but I believe there's quite a hefty fee for each transaction, so I never really went any further forward with it. Yeah, so far I've just found privacy.com to be the best option. But the other reason I use privacy.com is to purchase goods and get them delivered in my cat's name, for example, because I don't want mail. And by the way, if you order from Amazon and it's a reseller or some merchant that sells through Amazon, they're sharing your name and address. So this is why I also use an alias name with that, because I've had follow-up emails and even letters come in the post to the alias name. Obviously, that merchant has taken a copy of that, which they shouldn't do, but obviously I don't want to reveal that information. Okay, so the next item in your email, you're mentioning pfSense, but also said something about Ubiquiti. You've been using an edge router, or edge router for you Americans, for years, and do I recommend any settings? Okay, yes, I have used Ubiquiti. I actually still use it. I have 3 access points. They're the Ubiquiti access points in my home network. The reason I use that is that obviously it's great coverage, but it also supports VLANs. And I think I've mentioned before, I have a VLAN for IoT devices. I'm a huge fan, and a lot of you will hate me for this, and I've mentioned it before. I'm a huge fan of the Roborock vacuum cleaners, the robot vacuum cleaners. I've got a couple of them. I like the fact that they're LiDAR. They don't have cameras. So yes, they're mapping my house, but again, the account is in an alias name. So map away. It's not going to see anything other than table and chairs and cat and maybe a dog sitting there. But I prefer those devices to be on a separate network and a separate VLAN. So the Ubiquiti access points support VLAN, so I can do that. Obviously, I have a guest VLAN for visitors. I have a corporate or work VLAN for my company laptop, and then my main VLAN. So all of those are on different Wi-Fi SSIDs, which is really useful. Now, other than that, I also use the Ubiquiti Cloud Key, G2, I think it is. And that's so I can manage the Wi-Fi access points and have a controller. You don't have to use that. I believe you can still download the controller software for your PC, but I prefer to have that as a separate device. Now, to answer your main question around the Edge router, I had the Edge router Lite a long time ago. I think it's a solid device. I actually had different VPNs running on there, so you can still achieve what you do with pfSense. But unfortunately, I don't have a blog on that or anything recent. But if you want some help, feel free to email me again if you have any specific questions, and I'll see what I can do to advise you there. Another email here from Harry Potter. Again, I'm making these names up. So it says, Hi, I am a fellow Brit living in the USA with the same passion for privacy as you have. I like the podcast to keep them going. So first of all, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Okay, here's another approach to checking into hotels anonymously. So you probably have a credit card in your name, first, last. Contact your credit card company and request another card in the name of first, middle. They will send it to you. I'll actually stop there. I have actually requested that from American Express, and I've tried several times. And I know Michael Bazell talked about this probably a year or more ago on his show. I've not had any luck. They refuse to do that to me. Yeah, I'd like to know, let me know which credit card company you use to do that, because certainly with American Express, they weren't willing to play ball with me at all. Then you go on to say when checking into the hotel, you give the credit card first before you give them the ID. Yeah, I think it's great suggestions here. The credit card is key. If I could get a credit card with first and middle name, that would be great. And I did actually request this, but didn't have much luck. And I actually have another email here also asking about the Ubiquiti Dream Machine. So a lot of requests around Ubiquiti. I don't have a problem with it. I don't know what data they're collecting. Obviously, it is a proprietary system. So I would be slightly apprehensive. You know, if you're heavily into privacy and security, as you know, I'm a big fan of pfSense. But it is not as easy to set up. Obviously, you have to have a device to put it on. I think I've mentioned in previous shows, I use the Quotum Mini PC, which you can get on Amazon. I think that works really well. That said, Ubiquiti is still something I'm a fan of. I just haven't got enough to say on the security and privacy of it because I just don't know what's going on from a data collection point of view. Now, since I've had Lawrence Gentilello, who's the CEO of Optery, on a previous show, I've received a number of emails and some LinkedIn messages around podcast guests. And yeah, I would love to have more guests on the show. If you have any suggestions, please do email me. And I'd love to talk about cybersecurity, ethical hacking, hacking in general, threat actors, privacy. I think all of those topics are relevant to you and certainly of interest to me as well. If you have questions and would like me to read them out on the next show, you can email me at lockdownpodcast@protonmail.com. And if you have any suggestions for topics, do let me know. My dream guest, I think, for this show would have to be Sam Esmail, the writer and director for the TV series Mr. Robot. So if any of you happen to have any contact with Sam, yeah, I'm not sure it's going to happen. I was going to say, let him know, but I can only dream. With that, I'm going to wish you farewell and talk to you next time.